Welcome back everyone, I'm Shaun, former British serviceman and Ukrainian Marine. It's another intense week here in Ukraine, on the battlefield, in the halls of the United Nations and in the propaganda war that never seems to stop. If you caught my last podcast review, you'll know I said this week would bring more pressure on Ukrainian cities. Sadly, that prediction proved correct. Although Ukraine is pushing forward around Pokrovsk, grinding down Russia's forces in a fight that has become symbolic of both resilience and survival. At the same time, in New York, the United Nations Security Council met once again to debate the war. Another session filled with speeches and a familiar theatre of Russia pretending to be the victim while continuing its aggression. And speaking of theatre, in the West, Pearson Sharp of One American News and a regular on RT, Russian state media, released yet another so-called report, a piece of Kremlin-aligned propaganda dressed up as journalism. I'll have more to say on that shortly. So, today we're going to walk through it all. Ukraine's recently announced counter-offensive, the UN's political games, the propaganda war spilling into the Western media, and the latest strikes here in Dnipro. 40 minutes of hard-hitting reality with no spin. Let's start with the front line and what's really happening around Pokrovsk.
For Russia, it's a prize. For Kyiv, it's a lifeline. In eastern Donetsk, President Zelensky presented medals to soldiers taking part in what Kyiv says is an ongoing counteroffensive against the Russian army. Ukraine says the fighting is intense and centred here around Dobropilya, to the northeast of the key town of Pokrovsk, a vital road and rail hub for the Ukrainian military fighting in the Donbass.
This area has become one of the most intense battlegrounds of the war. Russia has thrown men, machines at it for months, trying to grind their way through, but Ukraine has not only just held, it's now beginning to push back. In the last week, Ukrainian forces advanced in several sectors. In some places, gains were measured in hundreds of meters, in others, in entire square kilometers. According to Commander-in-Chief Alexander Sikorski, Ukraine has restored control over more than 164 square kilometers of territory. 7 settlements have been liberated, and in Pokrovsk district alone, Ukrainian assault units advanced up to 2.5 kilometers. Now, to some, that might sound small, but remember, this is terrain that Russia claimed would collapse last Christmas. Western so-called experts said Pokrovsk would fall in weeks. The reality is the meat grinder for Russia, and Ukraine is making them pay. I've walked these fields, I've seen the ridgelines, the forests, the ravines. For an advancing army, it's not an open highway. It's a nightmare out of ambush points, mined approaches, interlocking defences. That's why Russians are losing thousands every kilometre. In fact, Sikorski reported that Russian forces have lost nearly 2,700 men in the direction since the operation began, with almost 1,500 killed outright. So when you hear the word meat grinder, that's not an exaggeration. That's reality. Pokrovsk is swallowing Russian manpower equipment at a rate they can't sustain. Why does this matter? Because Pokrovsk isn't just another dot on a map. It's a logistical hub, a lifeline to the north and south axis of Donbass. If Ukraine holds it, Russia's dreams of cutting deeper into Donetsk collapsed. It's also symbolic. For the soldiers on the ground, every meter we gain tells them Russia can be pushed back. For civilians, it means one more village freed from occupation and one more chance to return home. So that's the ground truth from Pokrovsk. Ukraine is pushing forward despite the odds. Russia is bleeding manpower despite its propaganda, and the so-called inevitable collapse, it simply isn't happening. Now let's shift from the battlefield to the political theatre, the United Nations Security Council, where words, not weapons, dominated this week's fight.
To the representatives of Russia, I have this to say. We know you don't care for international law and you are incapable of living in peace with your neighbors. Your insane nationalism contains a lust for domination that will not cease until you realize that the age of empires is over and that your empire will not be rebuilt. Every drone strike by the heroes of the armed forces of Ukraine, may God bless them, brings this day closer. Your 3-day special military operation can't even conquer Donbass for 10 years now. But the potential for criminal, catastrophic Russian mistakes is still there. By ordering mobilization in 1914, you precipitated the start of World War I, which bled Europe white and led to your Bolshevik Revolution. By signing the Hitler-Stalin Pact, you helped launch World War II, the bloodiest in history. By Sovietizing Central Europe, you caused the Cold War. Don't start another one. We are peaceful democracies who have studiously avoided actively joining your attempt to reconquer Ukraine. But we will not be intimidated. I have only one request to the Russian government. If another missile or aircraft enters our space without permission, deliberately or by mistake, and gets shot down and the wreckage falls on NATO territory, please don't come here to whine about it. You have been warned. Thank you.
From the battlefield to Donetsk, we move to New York, the chambers of the United Nations Security Council. This week, the Council once again gathered to discuss the war in Ukraine, another session filled with speeches, condemnation, and of course predictability. Russia's veto power being used as a shield. Russia sat there, as it always does, pretending to be misunderstood peacekeeper, playing the victim card, claiming it's under threat, while its missiles slam into Ukrainian cities. Hypocrisy couldn't be any clearer. At that very moment, diplomats spoke about peace. Dnipro was under ballistic attack. Poland's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, cut through the noise when he said, "Peace through strength, the only kind the Kremlin respects." Ukraine's allies, the United States, Britain, France and Poland, made it clear that support will not waver.
For 3.5 years, the world has witnessed a permanent member of this council engaged in the full-scale and unprovoked invasion of another state, a violation of its most basic obligations under the UN Charter. As President Trump and President Zelensky have worked for peace, the Russian Federation has starkly escalated its attacks.
As Sikorski reminded the chamber, no one wants and needs peace in Ukraine more than Ukrainians. No one has a larger stake in European security than us, Europeans, and no one has a greater power to end this conflict than Russia. But let's be honest. The UN has become a stage, a theatre where Russia gets to perform. It talks about peace. It talks about vetoing every real measure that might bring justice. The very system meant to prevent war is paralysed by the aggressor sitting at the table. From my perspective, having seen Mariupol, having lived through captivity, the UN debate feels hollow. Words don't stop artillery, declarations don't protect children from airstrikes, and vetoes don't erase war crimes. As Sikorski bluntly put it, all Russia needs to do is stop the killing and leave the territory she illegally occupied. That's the truth nobody really wants to hear. Still, these sessions do matter. They matter because they put Russia's crimes on record. They matter because every lie Russia tells is challenged in front of the world. And they matter because Ukraine is not alone. As Sikorski pledged, we as Europeans will continue to stand side by side with Ukraine to achieve a just, lasting peace. And speaking of narratives, while Russia's lying in New York, it also exports the lies into Western living rooms through state media and through so-called journalists who push Kremlin talking points. Which brings us to Pearson Sharp. One American news so-called journalist, I struggle to even put the words out, but let's talk about that next.
We've seen photos of you interacting with the people who are fighting this war. What can you tell us about those people?
So we actually got to visit some of the troops who are fighting for the Russians against the Ukrainians. And the incredible part was that these aren't Russian soldiers. These are Ukrainians. And they've decided to join with Russia and fight against the Ukrainian regime, as they call it.
And while Russia was spinning lies inside the UN, its propaganda was also being piped into Western living rooms. Pearson Sharp of One American News, OANN, released his latest so-called report on Ukraine. To call it journalism would be an insult to the word. It was nothing more than a masterclass in Kremlin talking points, a slick video and report designed to dress Moscow's brutality up as inevitability and to portray Ukraine as the villain of its own tragedy. My reaction? Simple. Shame he didn't turn up in Mariupol before they shot and bombed everybody and placed people in Nazi-style filtration camps. Maybe then he would have seen the truth before he tried to rewrite it. I was there. I fought in Mariupol. I saw the destruction. I lived the captivity. And I can tell you straight, Russia didn't liberate anything. It slaughtered, imprisoned and deported. And this is why propaganda is so dangerous. It's not just lies, it's an attempt to erase memory, to tell the world that the crimes never happened, to gaslight the survivors into silence. When I was captured, I relied on my SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance and escape. Part of that training is to know when to stay silent, when to be cautious, and when to resist, because propaganda isn't just a word. In the wrong hand, it's a weapon and sometimes more powerful than bombs. So when Pearson Sharp broadcasts Kremlin narratives to an American audience or on X, he's not just commenting, he's actively working to undermine the truth, to weaken support for Ukraine and to justify Russian war crimes. This is a tactic. Deny atrocities, claim Ukraine is the aggressor, call occupied cities liberated and cast Western aid as some grand conspiracy in the same script Russia has run for years, only now repeated by a man in a studio or on the ground in the occupied territories. My counter is simple. Speak the truth, share the stories, remember the victims and never allow those filtration camps, those executions and sham trials to be forgotten. Which brings me back home, because while OANN spreads lies abroad, here in Ukraine reality is clear. This week in Dnipro, families woke to sirens and explosions. That's the truth on the ground. That's where we're heading next.
Yeah. Really big.
While Pearson Sharp pushes lies from the occupied territories, here in Dnipro we face the reality of Russia's war. This week, ballistic missiles once again struck the city. Families jolted awake by air raid alarms, windows shattering, smoke rising all over the neighbourhoods. It's the same story, but it never gets easier. In my last podcast, I said the pressure on Ukraine's cities would escalate. Sadly, I was right. Dnipro, Kharkiv, Kiev, all targeted in a campaign designed not for victory but for terror. These aren't just random explosions, they are deliberate strikes on civilian infrastructure, apartment blocks, schools, power stations, hospitals. Russia wants to break morale, to make Ukrainians feel unsafe in their own homes. And yet, life continues. The morning after the strikes, people were back on the streets, cafes are open, kids went to school, couples celebrated their anniversaries. Like me. Even under the shadow of war, Dnipro keeps moving forward. And that's what makes the propaganda so hollow. OANN can say Mariupol was liberated. Russia can claim it's fighting NATO. But here in Dnipro, the truth is written in shattered glass. Air raid sirens. I've seen people cleaning debris from their living rooms. They're heading to work as if nothing had even happened. I've watched children play football in the park while the sound of an ambulance wails in the background. That's the resilience Russia will never understand. Militarily, the strikes are meant to sap resources, to force Ukraine to spend air defense interceptors, to damage the grid, to keep the cities on edge. But strategically, it fails. Every missile only hardens Ukrainian resolve. So yes, Dnipro was hit again this week, but the city is still here, the people are still here, and no amount of missiles or propaganda will erase the truth. And that brings us to a close. From the push in Pokrovsk to the theatre in UN, to the lies on the OANN, and the reality in Dnipro, Ukraine is fighting on all fronts. So let's wrap this up.
The Russian representatives is here, but of course not the one who makes the real decisions. That man fears to sit face to face with Ukraine and the world and openly admit he wants only war. Instead, Putin sends delegates who cannot and don't want to stop the bloodshed. And when he appears abroad in Beijing or somewhere else, it's only to buy more time for killing, pretending he seeks diplomacy. Putin only cares about using every meeting, every chance to keep the war going. Each day Russia kills our people, destroys our cities, and leaves no sign it will ever return to the principles of the UN Charter.
So let's bring it all together. This week we've seen Ukraine pushing forward around Pokrovsk, grinding down Russian forces and proving once again that a Russian collapse is not inevitable. We've seen the United Nations debate descend into the same theatre, Russians lying through their teeth, while our allies like Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski reminded the world that peace through strength is the only kind the Kremlin respects. We've watched Pearson Sharp and OANN pump out Kremlin propaganda trying to erase the truth in places like Mariupol, but the reality of the filtration camps and the executions cannot be covered up with slick editing and lies. And here in Dnipro, the reality is simple. Ballistic missiles struck again, yet the city endures, families endure, life continues under the sirens. That's the resilience Russia will never be able to break. This is a war in Ukraine, not just a war of armies, but of narratives. A war where every kilometre matters, every voice matters, every truth told matters. My ask to you is simple. Don't let propaganda drown out reality. Share the stories, support Ukraine, remember the people still suffering under occupation and the prisoners still waiting in Russian cells. I lived through Mariupol, I lived through captivity, and I know for one thing certain, Ukraine will endure because Ukrainians will never stop fighting for their land, their families and their future. Thank you for joining me. It's been a hard look at the week in Ukraine, from Pokrovsk to the UN to fake propaganda to Dnipro. Until the next time, stay informed, stay resilient and stand with Ukraine. Slava Ukraine.